Hi, my name is Ryan O'Sullivan, and I did my lecture on surf rock and roll. So, California really became this melting pot of surfing culture. After World War II, there was a lot of migration into California. A lot of people were stationed out here during the war, and a lot of GIs decided to move their family out there from the Midwest. The weather was warmer, there were more jobs, lots of money, and there was always that idea of Hollywood stardom. So in the 1950s and 60s, there was a huge movement of, or an influx of people that moved into California and really fostered, and when they had kids, the baby boomer generation really bought onto this idea of surf rock and roll, and it just really fostered a new influence in the music industry. Surf culture really hit home in Southern California in the greater Los Angeles area. Duke Kahanamoku came to the United States, or to the mainland from Hawaii in the early 1900s and introduced surfing to Santa Cruz, Huntington, Malibu, and the East Coast as well. And while doing so, he really inspired a whole generation of surfers. And the baby boomers were really a second generation of these really die-hard surfers, and they really wanted to have an impact not only in the water but across the planet via music. And a lot of those places are still prominent surfing places today. Malibu. Surfing is a very visual thing, and it's sort of hard to describe surfing, somebody standing on a wave and riding it. So movies were really starting to become popular, and they were shown worldwide. Some of the first really big surfing movie was Slippery When Wet, and the music in that was actually jazz music by Bud Shank. The real movie that got the whole surfing movement going was The Endless Summer, and in that movie there's a band called the Sandals, and they did all the music for it. They did the whole soundtrack, and in that movie, you start to hear that classic surfer rock sound where it's a lot of just guitar, sort of, again, like jazz, but using different instruments. You're not using a saxophone or a trumpet. Instead, you're using a guitar and a bass and a drum, and it a lot of it's free form, and even though it is routine, it seems like it's made up, and it really fits the whole vibe of surfing. So contrary to popular belief, there were actually two real types of surf rock. There was the vocal surf rock, and then there was the instrumental surf rock. Both were extremely popular at the time, but the people who liked them, there was sort of a beef between the two. Vocal uh, bands were more poppy, and they were thought of to be more of posers than the instrumentals, who were the instrumentalists, who were thought to be more traditionalist in a way. And a lot of the surfers thought that, or real surfers that listened to surf rock, thought the instrumentalist was a lot more, or visualized surfing more, because it was up to interpretation. The meaning behind the song could be interpreted by anybody, whereas vocal had lyrics already planned out, and they couldn't really be interpreted as well as the instrumental rock. With that being said, the biggest band to come out of the surf rock era was the Beach Boys. They had tons of hits. They started out as the Pendletons in Southern California, and the just fostered in that Los Angeles area. They came out with great hits just talking about what it was like to surf in the area, and that caught fire. Everybody wanted to surf, and everybody wanted to be like the Beach Boys. They were one of the few bands that contested the Beatles in the early and mid 60s and even 70s. Their songs were revolutionary. Good Vibrations is a song that used a ton, or had a ton of different work and a ton of different visual aids to get the song completed and to what we hear today. Jan and Dean surfing. Surf City is a really big one, talking about Huntington Beach. And again, it talked about or they really depicted and reflected what it was like to be a surfer and really talked about the highs of surfing. Instrumental bands, these bands didn't really gain as much traction in the long run as the Beach Boys did, but they definitely had a significant impact, and again, among local hardcore surfers, they were the favorites. Dick Dale, one of the first, probably the first uh, Middle Eastern superstar in America, was definitely the head of the instrumental surf rock movement. Miserly, which is actually an Egyptian song, he performed on an electric guitar and sold like wildfire. Surf and Drums was another big song. The Ventures and the Safaris all were popular as well. And another key difference between vocal surf rock and instrumental surf rock is that instrumental surf rock, a lot of the bands did the same songs, and it was sort of like a badge of honor. If you could play a certain song on a guitar, you were accepted at a higher or a more proficient level. So a lot of these bands performed similar songs. For example, the Ventures and the Safaris both played Wipeout at some point. And there are other bands there's hundreds of these bands that all played very similar music or even the same songs. And it was really just a way of their interpreting surfing, and how they played it reflected where they surfed and how they surfed. This style of music really, really was popular. It depicted this California lifestyle of money, fun, and freedom. The baby boom generation was one of the first generations to have money, and they were free to spend their money on stuff that previous generations couldn't. Surfboards are and were expensive, and unless you didn't make them, you'd have to spend a good amount of money to get one. Cars, it was one of the first times where people would buy one or two cars. There were 2-car families, and the kids could load up their cars and go down to the beach and have fun for the day. And even though it sold really well in America, another huge hotspot for the surf rock was Japan. The Ventures were huge in Japan. They toured in Japan. They were actually, at some points of their career, more popular in Japan than they were in America. So there's a huge demand for this type of music worldwide. There was also a huge influence on street racing, and you see this a lot with the Beach Boys, of course, Shut It Down, Little Deuce Coupe, but people were souping up their cars and they would race between the lights. You would hear people talking about pink slips and racing for each other's cars, and it was this thrill. It was when the lights went down, the kids would come out, and again, it sort of talked about this freedom and this new American sort of way to have fun and the thrill of life, and it really ventured outside of surfing and crept into other aspects of teen life in America. Surf rock still has an impact on today's music. There's this new wave of surf rock that's growing in California, and it's really classified as indie rock, independent rock in some areas, but it does have a pretty large influence from surf rock. The Alalas, Somersault, King Tuff, and the Beach Fossils are just some of the bands that I found, or that I know of, that are really have these characteristics of surf rock. A lot of heavy guitar, a little bit of bass, light drums in the background, really free flowing, but again, rhythmic and really easy to follow. And it really shows that, like rock and roll in general, this genre of rock and roll can evolve and diversify based on a time and place. And even though it might fade out of style for a little bit, there are still bands that will continue to have elements of surf rock and be influenced by surfing in rock and roll.